What happened at your school that still doesn't feel real? I was halfway through the state exam when my prosthetic hand started malfunctioning. In just seconds, my fingers were curling in on itself. Mr. Rogers, I gasped as the motors whined. Something's wrong with my prosthetic. Mr. Rogers didn't even glance up from his clipboard. State testing protocol. No disruptions, no exceptions. The mechanical fingers were digging into the palm now. The pressure was way beyond what it should be. This is a medical emergency. The safety features aren't working. How convenient. He finally looked at me. Your prosthetic just happens to break during the most important test of the year? Crack. One of the plastic joints in the thumb snapped. It's literally breaking apart. Then you should have taken better care of your equipment. The prosthetic hand was designed to grip with the same pressure as a normal human hand, but it was squeezing way harder than that now. Please just let me disconnect it because there's an emergency release button. Touch that device and you fail automatically since no electronic devices are allowed during state exams. Destiny, who was sitting next to me, leaned over and whispered with concern in her voice, "Is that smoke coming from your arm?" Gray fog was rising from my wrist joint where the motors were overheating, and the smell of burning plastic filled my nostrils while the heat spread up my forearm. Mr. Rogers, it's literally on fire! Stop being dramatic when we only have 17 minutes left. The prosthetic hand suddenly jerked open with all 5 fingers shooting straight out, then slammed back into a fist with so much force that my desk cracked under the impact. It felt like someone was trying to unscrew my arm from my body. "Oh my gosh!" Willie shouted from the back row as he jumped to his feet. "We need to get him help now before something worse happens." "Silence!" Mr. Rogers roared with his face turning red. "The next person who speaks gets expelled from the district." Jane from 2 rows over was frantically texting under her desk while trying to stay hidden. "I'm calling my mom because she's a nurse at the hospital. Phone now!" Mr. Rogers marched toward her with his hand extended. I tried reaching for the emergency release with my left hand, but my fingers were shaking too badly to grip the small button properly. The prosthetic was rotating now, with the entire hand spinning way past its normal range of motion. Blood ran down my arm and dripped onto the test paper. "Someone call 911!" Destiny was crying as she jumped up and ran for the door in desperation. Mr. Rogers moved quickly to block her path. "Sit down immediately or you're suspended for the rest of the year." "He's bleeding and needs medical attention," she screamed directly in his face. "Everyone needs to put their phones away now because state testing violations will be prosecuted to the fullest extent." 3 more students stood up simultaneously, and Josh, the quarterback who'd never gotten in trouble before, stepped into the aisle with determination. "This is insane, and you need to let him get help before it's too late. You want to lose your football scholarship, Josh? Then sit down and be quiet." Every forced rotation sent lightning bolts of pain through my nerves, while the burning smell grew stronger. "Just rip it off and get it over with," someone yelled from the corner. I couldn't do that. The titanium post was surgically implanted directly into my bone after 8 months of procedures, drilled right into the marrow. Katie was crying while banging on the window to get someone's attention in the hallway. "Help! Somebody please help us! He's dying!" Mr. Rogers marched over to where I was writhing in my seat. "This ridiculous performance ends right now. Don't touch it!" I screamed as loud as I could. "Mr. Rogers, no!" Multiple students yelled in unison as they saw him reaching for my arm, but he grabbed the prosthetic wrist with both hands. "I've had enough of your attention-seeking behavior and fake emergencies." He yanked with all his strength. The sound that came out of me wasn't human. He didn't just pull off a prosthetic like taking off a glove. He ripped out the metal post, drilled into my bone, chunks of muscle tissue, and connected nerves. Blood sprayed across 3 desks. I hit the floor hard, clutching what was left of my arm with my remaining hand. "Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh!" Multiple voices were screaming at once. "Nobody move!" He was backing away slowly while still holding my prosthetic like he couldn't believe what he'd done. His face had turned completely white. "State testing protocol says..." Willie was slamming his full body weight against the door repeatedly. "It's locked! Why the hell is it locked? Automatic locks engage during testing periods, and no one leaves for 13 more minutes." Josh and 3 other football players rushed toward Mr. Rogers at once. "Give us your keys right now! Stay back or you're all getting expelled and losing your futures." My vision started tunneling to black, while the pain reached levels beyond description. "Stay with me and keep your eyes open." Destiny was slapping my face gently. "Don't you dare close your eyes." More students were pounding on the door from both sides, and someone picked up a desk chair with determination. "Don't you dare break that," Mr. Rogers started to say. Crash! The window shattered into 1,000 pieces as the chair went through it. Bang! The door suddenly exploded open, and the janitor stood there holding a set of master keys. His eyes widened as he took in the scene of blood and chaos. "What the F? Call 911 now!" Everyone screamed at once. At the hospital, I had to go through 3 surgeries. First one just to save my life. Second, to repair what they could. Third, to prepare for a new prosthetic someday. I had 40% blood loss. Any more, and I wouldn't have made it. Mr. Rogers was arrested in the parking lot, my prosthetic still in his hand, my tissue still hanging from it. The state testing board gave him paid leave, but that wasn't enough. He tore my arm off, so I was ready to tear apart his life, limb by limb. The first thing that broke through the fog was that sound, that wet tearing noise when the titanium post ripped out of my bone. My eyes shot open to bright hospital lights and monitors beeping everywhere. The nurse checking my IV jumped back when I started thrashing, and she grabbed my shoulders to hold me down. "You're safe now. You're in the ICU," she kept saying while I tried to figure out where I was. My throat felt like sandpaper, and when I tried to talk, nothing came out but a croak. She gave me ice chips that melted on my tongue while explaining I'd been out for 2 days after 3 back-to-back surgeries. "You've been screaming in your sleep," she said quietly while adjusting the morphine drip. My parents were slumped in chairs by the window, and Mom's eyes were red and puffy when she noticed I was awake. Dad's hands were shaking as he stood up and walked over to my bed. They'd heard everything, every scream, every nightmare about that classroom. The detective showed up that afternoon while I was still floating from the pain meds. He pulled out a notebook and clicked his pen while asking me to start from the beginning. My words came out slow and slurred, but I told him about the prosthetic crushing itself, the smoke rising from the motors, Mr. Rogers refusing to let anyone help. He wrote down every detail about the locked doors that wouldn't open for 13 minutes minutes while I bled out on the floor. "We have the prosthetic as evidence," he said while flipping through photos on his phone. The image made my stomach turn because my tissue was still hanging from the metal fingers like some horror movie prop. The district sent their representative the next morning, and she stood at the foot of my bed reading from index cards about their ongoing investigation and commitment to student safety. Her eyes kept darting to the ceiling, the walls, anywhere but the thick bandages wrapped around what was left of my arm. She droned on about policies and procedures while I watched the IV drip and counted the seconds until she'd leave. "Get out," I finally managed to say, and she practically ran from the room. Destiny showed up on day 3 looking like she hadn't slept since the incident. Her hands were shaking and tears started rolling down her face before she even sat down. "I should have tackled him," she kept saying over and over. "I should have done something sooner instead of just standing there." She described watching me pass out from blood loss and thinking I was dying right there on the classroom floor. I told her she saved my life by slapping me awake when everything was going black, but she just shook her head and cried harder. My phone started buzzing non-stop when someone posted a video from the classroom online. The footage was grainy and only 30 seconds long, but you could hear the screaming and see the chaos as students tried to break down the door. The comments section exploded with people calling for Mr. Rogers to be fired immediately, while others demanded criminal charges. My notifications wouldn't stop coming, and each ping made my head pound worse. The hospital financial counselor knocked on my door that afternoon with a thick folder of paperwork. She explained in this calm voice that a new prosthetic would cost at least $40,000, and that didn't include the months of physical therapy I'd need. Insurance was reviewing whether this counted as a covered incident since the original prosthetic had malfunctioned before the injury. I wanted to throw something at her, but I only had one hand now and it was connected to an IV. She left more papers on my bedside table about payment plans and financial assistance programs. My first physical therapy session was just trying to sit up without falling over. The weight imbalance from my missing arm made everything feel wrong, and I kept tipping to one side. Something feels really off about how Mr. Rogers kept talking about state testing rules while a kid's arm was literally smoking and breaking apart. What kind of training makes someone ignore such obvious danger signs? The therapist had gentle hands, but every movement sent fire shooting through my shoulder where they'd tried to repair the damage. She helped me stand for 10 seconds before my legs gave out and I collapsed back onto the bed, gasping. "We'll take it slow," she promised while making notes on her clipboard. "Maybe 6 months before we can even think about fitting you for a new prosthetic." That night, the dream hit me hard, and I was back in that testing room with the doors slamming shut over and over. The locks kept clicking, and Mr. Rogers kept reaching for my arm no matter how much I screamed. I woke up to monitors going crazy and phantom pain burning through an arm that wasn't there anymore. The nurse rushed in and pushed something into my IV that made the world go soft around the edges. "It's for anxiety," she explained while resetting the alarms. The messages from classmates were split right down the middle when I finally checked my phone. Half were saying they were praying for me and couldn't believe what happened. The other half were posting that I probably broke my own prosthetic on purpose to get out of the test. Someone wrote a whole paragraph about how convenient it was that my device failed during the most important exam of the year. My finger hovered over the reply button, but instead I just deleted every social media app on my phone. Dad came by that evening and sat on the edge of my bed with this look on his face like he had something terrible to tell me. "They arrested Rogers in the school parking lot," he said slowly. "He still had your prosthetic in his hands with tissue still attached to it." His jaw clenched when he explained that the state testing board had given Mr. Rogers paid administrative leave pending their investigation. "Paid leave," he repeated like he couldn't believe the words. "For ripping your arm off, he gets paid leave." Mom burst through the door 10 minutes later with her phone already out and started scrolling through lawyer websites while Dad explained what happened. She kept saying we needed legal help right now, today, this second, but I told them to wait because I had other plans first, and lawyers would just slow everything down with their procedures and settlements and paperwork. Mom grabbed my good hand and said I was in shock, that I wasn't thinking clearly, but I'd never felt more focused in my life because Mr. Rogers needed to pay for what he did, and the legal system would take forever. My phone buzzed with a text from Willie, and when I opened it, there was a photo of the testing room with my desk still showing that huge crack from where my prosthetic had slammed down, plus dark stains on the floor they couldn't get clean. I saved the photo to a new folder I named Evidence and started typing out a list of everyone who was in that room, every single person who saw Mr. Rogers grab my arm and pull until it tore off. The hospital social worker knocked and came in with a stack of papers, explaining my rights as a victim and how the locked doors were a clear ADA violation since they prevented me from getting medical help during an emergency. She handed me pamphlets about trauma support groups and disability accommodations while I nodded and pretended to care, but really I was thinking about how I'd already found Mr. Rogers' home address on the county property records website. The next morning I called the ADA complaint hotline from my hospital bed and told the woman on the other end exactly what happened with the automatic locks that wouldn't open even when I was bleeding out on the floor. She kept gasping and saying, "Oh my goodness," as I described being trapped for 13 minutes while my arm was literally torn from my body, and she promised they'd investigate immediately because this was the worst violation she'd heard in 20 years. Josh texted me that afternoon saying the administrators were already telling everyone the doors have to lock during state testing with no exceptions ever, not even for fires or medical emergencies, because that's what the state requires. He'd been asking questions in every class, and the assistant principal had already pulled him aside twice to warn him about his attitude problem and how it might affect his college recommendations. I told him to keep asking anyway, and to record everything they said if he could do it without getting caught. My parents went behind my back and hired a civil attorney named Amina Farouk, who showed up at the hospital wearing a suit that probably cost more than our car, and immediately started firing off questions about the incident while taking notes on her tablet. She filed FOIA requests that same day for all the testing protocols, every email about the incident, Mr. Rogers' complete personnel file, and any previous complaints about him or the testing procedures. I realized that maybe having a lawyer wouldn't slow down my other plans after all, especially when she mentioned she could could subpoena security footage and force people to testify under oath. Amina came back the next day with a stack of document requests she was submitting to the school district. 17 different demands for every email, every policy manual, every previous complaint about testing protocols, or Mr. Rogers going back 10 years. The district would have 30 days to respond, and she said if they tried to hide anything, she'd file for sanctions and make them pay for obstruction. An anonymous student sent me a video through a fake Instagram account, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped because it was longer than the first one with crystal clear audio of Mr. Rogers saying, "State testing protocol," right before he grabbed my prosthetic. You could hear the crack when he pulled, my scream that followed, and then him saying, "Nobody move," while still holding my severed arm like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. Amina watched it 3 times and said this was direct evidence of willful disregard for safety, that he chose testing rules over a student's life, and any jury would be horrified. Diego Alvarez from the prosthetics company called my hospital room and said he'd heard about the malfunction and wanted to examine the failed device to figure out what went wrong. He seemed genuinely upset about what happened and mentioned their insurance might cover a full replacement if the investigation showed it was mechanical failure rather than user error, which was the first bit of hope I'd had about getting a new arm. But then 3 days later, a letter arrived from the insurance company saying they were investigating whether this was a pre-existing device failure that I should have reported earlier, and they were pausing all coverage decisions until their investigation was complete, which could take up to 6 months. I read it twice before crumpling it up and punching the hospital wall with my remaining hand so hard that the nurse came running in because she thought I'd fallen. 2 days later, a local reporter named Seun Adebayo called my hospital room and asked if I'd be willing to talk about what happened in that testing room. My mom started to say no, but I grabbed the phone with my good hand and told him to come right away. When he arrived with his camera guy, I sat up in the hospital bed and didn't hold anything back. I described how the motors in my prosthetic started whining and overheating until gray smoke was pouring out of the wrist joint. I told him about the burning smell of melting plastic filling my nose, while the mechanical fingers crushed into my palm with way more force than they were designed for. I explained how it felt like someone was trying to unscrew my entire arm from my body, while Mr. Rogers just kept saying state testing protocol over and over. The camera guy had to stop filming twice because Seun looked like he was going to be sick. That night, the segment aired on the 6 o'clock news, and my phone started buzzing with texts from everyone who saw it. The next morning, Superintendent Yara Haddad's secretary called and said the superintendent needed to meet with me and my parents immediately about the incident. 3 hours later, she walked into my hospital room with 2 men in expensive suits who stayed near the door like bodyguards. She kept looking at the bandages covering what was left of my arm, and her hands were shaking when she set her briefcase on the table. She started talking about finding a path forward for everyone and how the district wanted to support my recovery in every way possible. The lawyers moved closer, and one of them pulled out a folder while the superintendent kept talking about healing and moving past this unfortunate situation. The lawyer slid a paper across my bed tray, and I saw the words non-disclosure agreement at the top in bold letters. Below that was something about a $50,000 education grant that would be paid immediately if I agreed to stop all public statements about the incident and withdraw my ADA complaint. Amina had just walked in to check on me, and when she saw the paper, she actually laughed out loud right in their faces. She picked up the NDA and read through it quickly before tossing it back at them like it was garbage. I pushed myself up higher in the bed and told them exactly what I wanted instead of their money. I wanted written policy changes that would guarantee medical emergencies could override any testing protocol no matter what. I wanted mandatory training for every single proctor in the district about recognizing and responding to student medical crises. And I wanted Mr. Rogers permanently banned from ever teaching or working with students again anywhere in the state. The superintendent's face went pale, and she said they would consider my requests and get back to us. Amina crossed her arms and said we'd see them in court if they thought $50,000 would make this go away. After they left, my phone buzzed with a text from Destiny, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped. She was in the principal's office getting written up for leaving her seat during state testing when she tried to help me. The way those lawyers tried to buy silence with $50,000 makes me wonder how often schools do this when something terrible happens. I'm really curious why they think money fixes everything instead of actually changing the dangerous rules that hurt students. She was panicking about her college applications because the disciplinary notice would show up on her transcript. I called her immediately and told her to get her parents involved right away because this was insane. The next day, Josh texted me that his football coach had pulled him aside after practice. The coach said administration was concerned about Josh's involvement in the situation, and if he kept speaking up about what happened, his scholarship recommendations might be affected. The threats were starting and they weren't being subtle about it. I was so mad I almost threw my phone, but Amina had better news when she arrived that afternoon. The FOIA documents we'd requested had finally come through, and she'd found something huge in the stack of papers. The auto-lock policy for testing rooms specifically stated there were no overrides for any reason, including medical emergencies. She also found 3 previous complaints about Mr. Rogers ignoring student medical needs during tests over the past 5 years. One kid had an asthma attack, and Mr. Rogers made him wait until testing ended to use his inhaler. Another student with diabetes wasn't allowed to check her blood sugar when she felt faint. A third had a seizure disorder, and Mr. Rogers refused to let the nurse in when the student started showing warning signs. We sent everything to Seun immediately, and he ran another segment that night showing the documents on screen. Parents started going crazy when they saw the proof that their kids could be trapped in a room during a medical emergency. Someone started a petition online demanding the district change the lock policy immediately. Within 2 days, over 800 people had signed it, and the school board had to schedule an emergency meeting because parents were calling non-stop. My phone dinged with a message from someone I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, I saw it was from the janitor who'd unlocked the door that day. He said he needed me to know something about those locks that nobody was talking about. There was a 5-minute delay built into the system before his master key would even work during testing periods for security reasons. Those 5 minutes of waiting while I bled out on the floor nearly killed me, and it was by design. I forwarded his message to Amina, and she immediately added it to our evidence file. Then my parents sat down next to my bed looking guilty and told me they'd hired a private investigator named Marek Kowalski without telling me because they wanted to know everything about Mr. Rogers. Marek had already found 2 previous incidents at other schools where Mr. Rogers had physically restrained students who tried to leave during standardized tests. Both cases were settled quietly with the families signing NDAs and Mr. Rogers moving to a new district each time. This wasn't his first time hurting a student, and the district either didn't know or didn't care when they hired him. 2 weeks after learning about his past, I was at the grocery store picking up milk when a toy robot on display started making this high-pitched whining sound. My whole body locked up instantly, and I dropped the milk carton, which exploded all over the floor. The mechanical noise kept getting louder in my head, even though it was just a tiny toy, and suddenly I couldn't breathe right. My knees hit the wet floor hard, and I was back in that testing room with the motors burning and Mr. Rogers reaching for my arm. An old lady found me curled up between the dairy case and a puddle of milk, shaking so bad I couldn't even speak. She called 911 while other shoppers gathered around staring at me like I was crazy. The paramedics kept asking what happened, but all I could do was clutch my bandaged stump and rock back and forth. They took me to the ER, where I spent 3 hours getting pumped full of anti-anxiety meds while nurses checked my vitals every 15 minutes. That same night I couldn't sleep, so I got in my car and just started driving around town at 2 a.m. Without really planning it, I ended up parked outside Mr. Rogers' house on Maple Street. His beat-up Honda was in the driveway, and all the lights were off inside. I sat there for over an hour just staring at his front door and thinking about all the different ways I could make him pay for what he did. My left hand was gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white and started cramping up. Part of me wanted to throw a brick through his window or slash his tires or do something to make him feel even a fraction of what I felt. But I finally drove home when I realized I was scaring myself with how much I wanted to hurt him. My parents made me start seeing this therapist named Priya Nair the next day at the hospital's trauma unit. She had me do these grounding exercises where I had to name 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, and 1 thing I could taste. We practiced breathing techniques, and she taught me to press my feet flat on the floor when the flashbacks started. She said the revenge fantasies were totally normal after what happened, but warned me not to act on them because it would only make things worse for me legally. I nodded and agreed with everything she said while mentally going over the notes Marek had given me about Mr. Rogers' daily schedule and which coffee shop he went to every morning. 3 days later, I had to sit through a civil deposition that lasted 5 whole hours in a conference room downtown. Amina prepped me beforehand, but nothing could have prepared me for having to describe every single second of that day in detail, while Mr. Rogers' lawyer kept interrupting with questions. He kept suggesting I was being dramatic, and that teenagers always exaggerate their injuries for attention. When he implied I probably damaged my own prosthetic on purpose to get out of the test, Amina slammed her hand on the table so hard the court reporter actually jumped in her seat. The lawyer kept pushing, though, asking why I didn't just leave the room if it was really that bad, like the locked doors and Mr. Rogers blocking everyone never happened. By the time we finished, I was drenched in sweat, and my phantom limb pain was so bad I could barely walk to the car. The state education board hearing started the following week in this big conference room at the district office. The district's lawyers spent 2 hours blaming Diego's prosthetics company for the whole thing, saying the device was defective, and Mr. Rogers couldn't have known how serious it was. They kept repeating that he was just following established testing protocols and doing his job. Diego sat in the gallery looking more and more disgusted as they basically threw his company under the bus to protect themselves. They even brought in their own expert who claimed the prosthetic must have had pre-existing damage that I should have reported earlier. That afternoon, the teachers' union released this statement about supporting established testing protocols and the need for maintaining test security. They didn't even mention Mr. Rogers by name, but everyone knew they were backing him up. Within an hour, I had messages from 3 different teachers at my school saying they were disgusted with the union for protecting him. One teacher even sent me screenshots of the union's internal emails where they called the whole thing an unfortunate incident that was being blown out of proportion. 2 days later, Diego called me with his lab report results, and it got complicated fast. There was water damage in the prosthetic from when I'd spilled a sports drink on it 3 weeks before the test, and the moisture had been slowly corroding the motor controls. The overheating happened because the wet circuits were shorting out, creating this perfect storm of mechanical failures all at once. When this came out in Discovery, Mr. Rogers' lawyer literally smiled in the meeting like he'd just won the lottery. Priya and I talked about it at our next session, and she kept pushing me to see that destroying Mr. Rogers wouldn't bring my arm back or undo what happened. She suggested I channel my anger into pushing for policy changes instead of revenge, saying it would help more kids in the future. I agreed with her out loud, and acted like I was having this big breakthrough about forgiveness and moving forward. Meanwhile, I was mentally reviewing every detail Marek had documented about Mr. Rogers' routine, like how he always parked in the same spot at the school and ate lunch alone in his classroom. The next Monday, Josh organized this huge student walkout demanding emergency exception policies for medical situations during testing. Even though the administration threatened his football scholarship and college recommendations, he stood in front of the district office with a megaphone leading 300 students in chants. They surrounded the building for 2 hours holding signs with my picture and slogans about student safety coming before test scores. Parents showed up to support them, and local news crews filmed everything while administrators watched from the windows looking panicked. The district responded that afternoon by announcing they'd hire an independent consultant to review their policies and make recommendations. They wouldn't say who the consultant was, when they'd start, or what exactly they'd be looking at, just that they were taking the matter seriously. It was such an obvious stalling tactic that even the local newspaper called them out in an editorial the next day. 2 weeks later, the prosecutor called me into her office downtown. She pushed a folder across her desk while explaining that Mr. Rogers' lawyer wanted to make a deal. The offer was reckless endangerment, 2 years probation, and his teaching license would be under review. No jail time at all. Amina sat next to me reading through the papers and shaking her head. She told me this was actually more than most cases like this got, but I could feel my stomach turning. Why Why does the district keep acting like that spilled sports drink from 3 weeks ago somehow makes it okay to lock a kid in a room while their hand burns off? The timing of finding that water damage feels really convenient for their lawyers. The man who ripped my arm off would walk free. I spent the next 3 days writing my victim impact statement at the kitchen table. Every word hurt to write, but I needed the court to understand what really happened. I described the exact moment the titanium post tore from my bone, the wet, ripping sound it made, how the blood sprayed across 3 desks in perfect arcs. I wrote about Mr. Rogers standing there holding my prosthetic with pieces of my muscle still hanging from it. The prosecutor read it and said it was powerful enough to make a difference. Meanwhile, Destiny texted me that her parents had hired a lawyer about the disciplinary threat. The school was trying to punish her for leaving her seat during the test to help me. Her lawyer sent one letter threatening to go public with the whole story. Within 48 hours, the disciplinary notice disappeared from her record. She sent me crying emojis and said at least one of them wouldn't have their future destroyed. The next school board meeting was packed with parents and students. Josh's football coach stood up at the microphone and told everyone that integrity mattered more than following bad rules. He said Josh showed real character by trying to help me that day. The whole room erupted in applause, and Josh's scholarship was officially safe. His coach sat back down, looking proud, while administrators looked uncomfortable in their seats. 3 days after that, I had another appointment with the surgical team at the hospital. They laid out all the options for a new prosthetic attachment on a big screen. The lead surgeon explained they could try osseointegration again, but it would take months of preparation. My bone needed to heal completely first, then they'd have to rebuild the attachment point. I was looking at a full year before I'd have 2 hands again. The following Monday, I had to go to the courthouse for a hearing about the criminal charges. I walked through the metal detector and turned the corner toward the courtroom. Mr. Rogers was sitting on a bench in the hallway with his lawyer. He looked so much smaller than I remembered. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his suit hung loose on his shoulders. For just a second, he started to stand up like he wanted to say something to me. His lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. The fact that someone had to grab his arm to stop him wasn't lost on me. That afternoon, I sat in Priya's office talking about what the sentencing might feel like. She warned me that even if he got convicted, it might feel empty. Justice wouldn't bring my arm back or undo what happened. I told her that Hollow was still better than this rage eating me alive every single day. She wrote something in her notebook and asked if I really believed that. 2 days later, the prosecutor called with news that made me actually smile. After reviewing all our evidence, including the video and the FOIA documents, she was adding a charge of willful disregard for safety. Mr. Rogers' lawyer filed an objection immediately, but the judge allowed it. Finally, someone was acknowledging what really happened in that room. It wasn't just an accident or a misunderstanding. He chose to ignore a medical emergency and then ripped my arm off. The next week, Amina got a call from the district's lawyers about the civil case. They wanted to settle, but not just with money. They offered specific policy changes instead of a bigger payout. Mandatory medical emergency overrides for all testing situations. Annual safety training for every teacher and administrator. A victim's fund for students hurt by negligent protocols. Amina said they were scared of what a jury would do if this went to trial. We had real leverage now, and they knew it. My parents thought I was crazy when I told them I wanted the policy changes instead of more money. Dad kept saying we could get hundreds of thousands more if we pushed for it. Mom reminded me about all the medical bills and the prosthetic costs, but I kept thinking about the next kid with a medical emergency during a test. The next student who needed help when protocol said no. Those policy changes would save someone else from going through what I did. The money would just sit in a bank account, but those new rules would protect kids for years. I signed the settlement papers the next morning. Amina made sure the policy changes were ironclad with specific deadlines and enforcement mechanisms. The district had 90 days to implement everything or face massive penalties. The safety training had to start within 30 days. The victims fund would be established immediately with the district's first payment. It felt like the first real victory since that day in the testing room. 2 weeks later at the school board meeting, the room was packed with parents holding signs about student safety. The board members sat behind their long table looking uncomfortable as parent after parent stood up during public comment to describe what happened to me. When they finally called for the vote on ending auto locks during testing, all 7 board members raised their hands immediately. The crowd exploded with clapping and cheering, while I sat there thinking about how it took my arm getting ripped off for them to care about basic safety. The new policy also required medical override training for every single teacher and administrator in the district starting next month. 3 days after that, I sat in the courtroom watching Mr. Rogers stand in front of the judge with his lawyer beside him. His hands were shaking as he said the words guilty to all charges, including willful disregard for safety and reckless endangerment. The judge read out his sentence of 2 years probation, permanent teaching license revocation, and a no-contact order that meant he could never come near me again. My mom squeezed my remaining hand as we listened to the judge explain that Mr. Rogers would never be allowed to teach anywhere in the state ever again. It wasn't enough for what he did to me, but at least no other kid would have to deal with him. The next morning, Amina called me into her office to go over the civil settlement paperwork. The district was offering $200,000 for medical costs, plus a very specific NDA that she'd spent weeks negotiating. I could still talk about safety issues and what happened that day, but I couldn't mention the exact dollar amount of the settlement. We signed the papers right there in her office while she explained that this was actually a really good outcome, considering most cases like this get buried completely. A week later, I got a text from Destiny saying her disciplinary record had been officially cleared by the district, and she was crying happy tears. Josh got called to the principal's office that same day, but instead of getting in trouble, they gave him a leadership award for his activism during the incident. All the other students who helped that day, Willie and Jane and Katie and everyone else, got official letters of commendation from the superintendent that would go in their permanent files for college applications. Small victories, but they mattered to the kids who risked their futures to help me. The prosthetics clinic scheduled my fitting appointment for the following Tuesday. The technician who worked with me was this woman with gentle hands who took her time measuring what was left of my arm for the new base. She told me she'd lost her leg in a car accident 5 years ago and understood exactly how scary it was to trust a new device device after something went wrong with the old one. We spent 3 hours getting every measurement perfect, and she showed me all the safety features built into the new model, including multiple emergency releases. By this point, my nightmares had gone from every single night to maybe twice a week, which Priya said was significant progress during our therapy session. I was actually sleeping 4 hours straight sometimes without waking up screaming about the tearing sound, which felt like a miracle after months of barely getting any rest. She had me doing these breathing exercises and grounding techniques that actually helped when the panic started creeping in. 2 months after the settlement, I stood at a podium in front of 300 people at a school safety forum the district organized. My voice only shook once when I described the automatic locks and how they trapped us while I was bleeding out. Parents were crying in the audience, and administrators were taking notes on their laptops, while students came up afterward to thank me for speaking up about what really happened that day. The parent coalition that had formed after my incident filed paperwork to become an official non-profit focused on student safety in schools. They asked me to join their board of directors, but I turned them down because I needed to stop being the poster child for this trauma and just be a regular person again. Around the same time, Diego called to tell me his company was issuing a voluntary recall for the motor assembly in my model of prosthetic after their investigation found a design flaw that could cause overheating under certain conditions. They were covering my new device completely as part of the recall settlement, and he personally apologized, even though the water damage I'd caused weeks before the incident was also a factor. The hardest thing was going back to that testing room with Priya for exposure therapy 6 months after it happened. The bloodstains were completely gone, and they'd replaced my desk along with the 3 others that got sprayed. We stood there for 20 minutes while I practiced my breathing exercises and tried to see it as just a regular classroom instead of the place where I almost died. The weird part was that I didn't panic like we both expected, just felt this hollow feeling in my chest as I looked at the spot where I'd collapsed. Priya said that was actually a good sign because it meant I was processing the trauma instead of being controlled by it. I'm really curious about how the judge decided on probation instead of jail time for ripping someone's arm off. What goes into making that kind of decision? The way they gave Mr. We walked out of that room together, and I realized I could breathe normally for the first time in months without that tight feeling in my chest. The district had installed a big red emergency override button next to every door that any teacher could press to unlock everything instantly. They'd also added medical kits to every classroom and required quarterly safety drills for medical emergencies, not just fires and lockdowns. 2 weeks later, the court clerk handed me the official no-contact order with Mr. Rogers' name printed in bold letters at the top. The document banned him from every school property in the state and required him to stay 500 feet away from me at all times. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my nightstand drawer where I could see it before bed each night. The nightmares were getting less frequent, but knowing he couldn't legally come near me helped me fall asleep faster. Seyoon called me 6 months after the incident to ask if I'd participate in a follow-up news segment about the safety changes. I met him at the school where they'd installed the new emergency buttons and watched him interview 3 other students who'd had medical emergencies during tests since then. One girl had a seizure, and the teacher pressed the button immediately to unlock the doors for paramedics. Another kid's insulin pump failed, and they got him help within 2 minutes. The segment aired that Friday night with a focus on how the new protocols were saving lives instead of just talking about what happened to me. Around the same time, I signed up for adapted driving lessons with special controls for one-handed operation. The instructor showed me how to use the spinner knob on the steering wheel and the turn signal extensions. I practiced parallel parking for 3 hours straight until I could do it smoothly. My friends were already planning a graduation party at Josh's house since we'd all missed so much school dealing with depositions and court dates. The makeup exams were scheduled for next month with proper accommodations, including extra time and a personal aide if needed. Life was moving forward in these small but important ways that made everything feel less stuck. The package from Diego's company arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I spent 20 minutes just staring at the new myoelectric prosthetic before even opening the box. The fingers were more advanced than my old model with individual motor control for each digit. Diego came by personally to help with the initial fitting and calibration. I practiced opening and closing the fingers for hours that first day. Picking up a pencil took 47 attempts before I managed it without dropping it. When I finally grabbed a water bottle and lifted it to my mouth successfully, Diego actually cheered and high-fived me with his left hand. 3 days later, Destiny organized a dinner at the cheap pizza place near the mall where we used to hang out before everything happened. Josh brought his new girlfriend, and Willie showed up with his acceptance letter to State College. We spent 2 hours talking about normal stuff like the terrible superhero movie that just came out, and Josh's dating disasters before he met his girlfriend. Jane complained about her summer job at the mall, and Katie talked about her plans to study nursing. The testing room came up once when the waiter asked about my prosthetic, but we quickly changed the subject to arguing about pizza toppings. We weren't just the kids from that day anymore. During my next therapy session, Priya suggested I write a letter to Mr. Rogers, saying everything I wanted to tell him. I spent an hour writing 3 pages about the pain and the fear and the anger that still woke me up at night. I wrote about how he chose protocol over my life and how I'd never forget the look on his face when he grabbed my arm. Priya had a small fireplace in her office, and we fed the pages into it together. The smoke alarm started beeping immediately, and we both started laughing so hard we couldn't stop. The building manager came running and found us waving magazines at the detector while crying from laughter. I started building my own toolkit for prosthetic maintenance, using Diego's recommendations for the right tools and lubricants. Every evening after dinner, I'd sit at my desk checking each joint and connection point. My parents would stand in the doorway watching me work with these tiny screwdrivers and adjustment tools. Mom would get this look on her face, and sometimes I'd catch her wiping her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. Dad said it was good to see me focused on something constructive instead of spending hours researching Mr. Rogers online like I did those first few months. 6 months after that day in the testing room, I woke up at 7 in the morning and realized I'd slept through the entire night. No nightmares about the locked door or the blood or the sound of the titanium post ripping out. My first thought wasn't about Mr. Rogers or revenge or even my my prosthetic. I was thinking about the waffles Mom was making downstairs, and my physical therapy appointment at noon, and maybe seeing if Josh and Destiny wanted to see a movie later. The testing room wasn't the first thing I thought about anymore when I woke up. I wasn't the kid who got his arm ripped off anymore. I was just me again. Thanks for hanging out and wondering through all of this with me. It's been really interesting sharing these moments together. Catch you next time. Like the video, it helps more than you think.